this time we're looking at static static properties, and essentially what a static property is, and we're going to use a quick example. You can see here that I'm requiring in this class file here count.php, in which inside I have nothing at the moment. Now we're going to take a look at creating a property that when we instantiate an object it holds a value. When we instantiate the same object again, we're going to see what happens. So, you know, sounds confusing, but let's go ahead and write this class out. So the class is obviously going to be called count because I've called the file count. I'm trying to keep the naming conventions. And inside here I'm going to create a protected variable or a property, and I'm going to call this count. Now when this class is or this object is instantiated, we create an object. I want to increment this count variable, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a constructor. So construct, and in here I want to say this count plus plus. Okay, so fairly straightforward. When we instantiate the object, we increment the count. Now we're going to go ahead and create a method to output this. So we want public function get count, and we're going to return exactly the same thing, but we're obviously not incrementing this time, we're just returning count. So fairly straightforward. Let's go ahead and instantiate this object and see what happens. So I'm going to say counter equals new count, and that's it. So when we run this, this variable here will be incremented by 1. By default it's going to be 0, so we'll just have the value 1. But now let's go ahead and just say echo counter get count. So we're outputting that to the page. So when I refresh, you see that we've got value 1. So the whole, you might be wondering, you know, what's the point of this? Why am I demonstrating this? Well, we've already looked at constants. Now this value here is going to remain the same. Well, it's going to essentially, when we create another instance of this, this is going to start all over again. So essentially all we're going to do is just go ahead and copy and paste this, and then go ahead and refresh, and we have 1 and 1 either side of each other. That's because that when we instantiate a new object, this protected property is part of that object that we've instantiated. It doesn't represent you know, a property of this class count as a whole. However, what we can do is we can create static properties. We can well, we've essentially just said protected static count, so we've applied this just after the visibility modifier. Now we can actually remove the visibility modifier, and this will work. In this case, we've got some problems here, and we'll address them in a moment. It's just the way that we're trying to call this static property. So you can omit the visibility modifier, in which case it will be public. However, it's always best to go in and place it in, even if you're doing a public property. So in this case, it's going to be a protected static property called count. Now we need to work out how to address these in here. And again, you may be thinking, why do we need to use this? Well, let's just say that we have a class that we want a property or a method, because we can apply this to methods as well. We want that to be individual to the overall class. We don't want to be able to say instantiate a new object, change a value, and then receive a return on a method, for example, based on anything that's changed within our instantiated object. We want it to be a part of the class as a whole. But really the only way to figure out when best to use static, particularly with methods, is to go ahead and test it for yourself. But we're going to be doing a few examples here anyway. Okay, so we've now got a protected static count. You saw that we got these errors just here, which is accessing a static property as a non-static. So essentially we're doing something wrong how we're accessing this. Now it's slightly different. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this altogether. Now what we do is we use self, and we use the scope resolution operator, and then we use the $sign, which is something that we haven't done before. We've omitted the $sign, like here, and then we give the property name, and we can just say plus plus. So straightforward as that. Self just refers to the class itself, and here we do exactly the same thing. So we're going to say self and then underscore count. Oops, I forgot the $sign, and that's it. So we've now corrected what we had wrong. Now let's go and refresh and see what happens. And now you can see that we've got 1 and 2. Now the reason that we've got 1 and 2 is because these instantiations, or these objects that we've created, now are, because we have this protected static count, are now tied to this class as a whole, not to the individual classes. So, you know, when's an example that we might need this? Well, one example might be if you are storing, say, a database connection somewhere. Every time you instantiate a new object, you're not going to need to change these values or anything like that. So really, a static property acts somewhat like a constant, and we can use it for this as well as creating static methods as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example with the static methods. So remember we had this, no, let's go ahead and do this in here. So we've got a class called count. We'll go ahead and get rid of this for now. Now I'm going to say create a protected, a public static function, if I can spell it correctly, static function, and I'm going to call this increment. Now what this is going to do is it's going to do exactly the same thing that the constructor does. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to say self count plus plus. So when I instantiate this, I can go ahead and say counter increment, and there we go. So when I refresh now, we've got 1, okay? And when we go ahead and do the same thing, we've got 2. So we've got exactly the same result here. However, if we wanted to go in and say extend this count class for whatever reason, which we probably wouldn't do, it's probably a terrible example, then the static function would need to be called slightly differently. And the reason that we do use static functions is because if you have a static function within a parent class, or a class like this count, it refers to the current state of the class, not of your extended class. So that's essentially how we would use a static method within a class. So again, it's hard to create examples for this, but play around with it. Play around with creating things statically and extending that we've already looked at, and see what kind of results you get.